There is a reason you felt compelled to close that door, and it was not weakness, and it was not shame, and it was not the quiet implosion of someone giving up on the world outside. It was the ancient instinct of a soul that has been chosen, marked, and now summoned into the sacred chamber where God prepares his most tested instruments for their most terrifying and glorious assignments. You did not retreat because you failed. You retreated because something in your spirit knew, with a knowing that bypassed language and logic and every rational explanation you tried to construct for people who could not understand it, that the room behind that closed door was the only place on earth where the next version of you could be safely born. The enemy saw you close that door and he panicked, not because isolation destroys you, but because he has studied the pattern long enough to know that when a chosen one goes quiet, when the noise of obligation and performance and people-pleasing finally falls away, God moves. And God moving in your direction is the one scenario the enemy has been burning every resource he has to prevent. That weight in your chest this week, that strange tension in your home that you could not name, those conversations that stopped cold the moment you walked into the room, none of that was random. None of it was coincidence. It was a coordinated, calculated, strategically timed assault launched by a panicking enemy who has already seen the assignment heaven just cleared your calendar to deliver, and he is desperate, and desperation makes even the spiritual underworld sloppy, and that sloppiness is exactly what is about to expose every trap he laid at your feet this season. You will not survive the next phase of your assignment carrying the psychological weight of every relationship that grew strange this week, every silence that felt like rejection, every moment of inexplicable exclusion that the enemy immediately rushed to interpret for you, whispering that they pulled away because you are too much, or not enough, or disqualified, or damaged beyond repair. That is the gaslighting. That is the operation. The enemy does not need to destroy you directly when he can simply manufacture the evidence of your unworthiness and play it on a loop inside your own mind until you disqualify yourself and hand him the victory without a single battle. He has been borrowing the faces and the silences of the people you love most and using them as projection screens for his lies about your identity. And you have been sitting in that darkness watching the film and believing it was a documentary about who you are, instead of recognizing it as a propaganda campaign designed by a defeated enemy who is terrified of who you are becoming. You won't defeat this attack alone. Breaking these emotional hexes requires a higher code, which is exactly why I just released the 3 Keys to a Prosperous Life trilogy, whose unlocking link is in the pinned comment. Access it before the fog blinds you again, before the next wave of strategic confusion rolls in and you mistake a panic attack for a prophecy about your future, before you look at the people who went quiet around you and conclude that their silence is a verdict, instead of a symptom of the seismic shift happening beneath the surface of every relationship you carry. The dream came again this week, did it not? The one where you are running and your legs will not move, where the threat is real and your body has become a prison, where every ounce of will you throw at forward motion produces nothing but the nauseating sensation of legs turned to wet concrete, while something dark and purposeful closes the distance between you and the thing you cannot name. That is not random neurological noise. That is the language of spiritual warfare translated into the only theater the enemy can access without your conscious permission, the sleeping mind. Psychologically, the persecution dream is the psyche's alarm system registering a threat that has already been identified at the subconscious level long before the waking self is willing to name it. The narcissist in your environment, the energy vampire who has attached themselves to your frequency under the camouflage of loyalty or friendship or family obligation, has been running a slow extraction on your spiritual reserves for so long that your deeper self is screaming the warning in the only language that bypasses your trained tolerance for abuse. The dream language of paralysis and pursuit. Your legs are heavy in that dream because you have been carrying spiritual weight that was never assigned to your shoulders. The accumulated debt of other people's unprocessed pain and unaddressed dysfunction that you absorbed into your own body. Because no one ever told you that empathy without boundaries is not a virtue. It is a slow, spiritual hemorrhage. The physical sensation you wake with is real. The tight chest, the residual dread, the sense that something in the night made contact with you because something did. The intrusive thought that follows you into the morning, the one that tells you the running without moving is a metaphor for your life, that you are trapped, that you will never actually escape the cycles you were born into. That thought is not revelation, it is injection. Your primitive memory stores the first time you felt that kind of helpless pursuit, perhaps a childhood home, where love came with conditions you could never fully meet, where safety was always one wrong word away from withdrawal. And the enemy is using that memory as a portal, reactivating old neural pathways of powerlessness to make a current spiritual assignment feel like an inescapable genetic destiny. But here is what the spiritual tribunal sees from its vantage point above the dream and above the dread. God allowed the enemy access to the dream theater to show you the exact shape of the chain, so that when he hands you the key, you will know precisely which lock it opens. The smile crossed the room before the words did. Wide, practiced, performing warmth for an audience that could not see the cold calculation moving behind the eyes that carried it. You felt it before you understood it. Some ancient animal part of you, the part that survived because it learned to read predators before they declared themselves, registered the slight delay between the emotional display and the emotional reality, registered the way the corners of the eyes did not participate in the smile the mouth was performing, registered the microsecond of something raw and green and burning that flashed across the face of someone who stood before you with open arms and claimed to celebrate you. The poisoned compliment is the narcissist's most sophisticated weapon because it exploits the one thing your spiritual nature is designed to resist: cynicism. You were built to believe the best, to extend grace, to receive love as genuine because your own love is genuine, and you do not naturally possess the wiring to manufacture warmth while feeling its opposite. So when the person who cannot stand your light wraps their contempt in the language of affirmation, your good nature accepts the package and your body pays the price. The vague unease after the conversation you cannot explain, the energy drop that follows the interaction you are supposed to have been uplifted by, the headache that arrives after being in the presence of someone whose mouth said one thing while their spirit screamed another. This is not paranoia. This is perception. And the enemy has spent years convincing you that your perception is a pathology, that the discomfort you feel around certain presences is social anxiety or excessive sensitivity or some flaw in your personality that you need to apologize for, when in reality it is the gift of discernment operating exactly as God designed it, a living alarm system in your spirit that distinguishes between frequencies before your conscious mind can construct the logical argument. The spiritual tribunal records every poisoned compliment. It registers the intent behind the performance. It documents the calculated deployment of false admiration as a mechanism to get close enough to observe, to copy, to extract, and to undermine. And heaven's record of what was done to your confidence through the systematic delivery of praise-shaped diminishment will be the very evidence that qualifies your promotion. Because God does not elevate the untested. He elevates the ones who were refined in the precise fire their assignment required them to survive. They do not want what you have. This is the part that takes the longest to land, the part that restructures everything you thought you understood about the imitation you have been watching from people whose obsession with your life you kept trying to explain through the most generous possible interpretation. They do not want what you have. They want to be who you are. They want the frequency, the anointing, the specific and unrepeatable spiritual signature that God assembled across every wound you survived, and every night you cried alone, and every moment you chose integrity when dishonesty would have been so much easier and more immediately profitable. They have watched you carry a grace that they could not manufacture, no matter how precisely they copied the external expressions of it. And that impossibility has driven them into a low-grade obsession that looks like admiration, but smells like something older and darker and fundamentally opposed to your flourishing. The blatant copy is a spiritual phenomenon before it is a psychological one. When someone is called to a purpose they refuse, reject, or have been disqualified from by their own choices, and they encounter someone else walking in the fullness of that kind of calling, something in the unclaimed destiny reaches toward the person carrying it with a hunger that the conscious mind translates as competition or curiosity or flattery, but which is in reality a form of spiritual covetousness, a desire not to celebrate, but to possess and consume the anointing they cannot cultivate. The narcissistic personality structure amplifies this dynamic to its most dangerous expression. The systematic study, replication, and eventual attempted takeover of your identity, your relationships, your aesthetic, your language, your spiritual vocabulary, your approach to healing, your testimony, your community. They cannot create because creation requires the vulnerability of authentic self-expression, and authentic self-expression requires a self that has been surrendered to something greater than ego. And the narcissistic wound is precisely the inability to make that surrender, so they harvest, they consume, they wear borrowed identities like stolen coats, and wonder why they still feel cold inside, why the audience they assembled using your blueprint does not fill the emptiness that was there before you, why the anointing does not transfer through imitation. The divine promotion hidden inside this scene is severe and luminous at once. Every attempt to copy you is God's way of circling in red ink exactly what is irreplaceable about you. The copy only exists because the original is too valuable to ignore. The weight arrived at 3 in the morning, pressing down on your sternum with a presence so specific, so intentional in its placement, that calling it anxiety felt like calling the ocean a puddle. Your eyes opened, but the rest of your body refused the command. Refused so completely that the very act of trying to move generated something beyond frustration, something closer to the primal terror of a mind that is fully conscious and present, while the body it inhabits has been temporarily vacated by its own cooperation. Sleep paralysis is the battlefield where the spiritual and the neurological collide in a way that science partially explains and completely undersells. Because while the clinical literature will tell you that the brain has failed to fully transition out of rematonia, the clinical literature has no accounting for why the presence that sits on your chest during these episodes carries specific emotional signatures. Dread, shaped like something that knows you. Oppression calibrated to your particular fears. A weight that feels less like a physiological anomaly and more like a visitation. The intrusive thought that floods in during those frozen minutes is not random. It surfaces your deepest spiritual wound, the one the enemy identified years ago and has been pressing on with increasing precision as your assignment grows closer to its activation. For some people, it is the thought of permanent abandonment. For others, it is the conviction of unworthiness so total, it feels like a verdict from a court beyond appeal. For you, it is something specific and tailored, something the enemy knows by name, because he has been assigned to your case long enough to have studied you with a thoroughness that would be flattering if it were not so predatory. The spiritual tribunal sees the invisible operating, the assignment of oppressive weight designed to communicate in the language of the body's most vulnerable state that you are pinned, that you are subject, that whatever elevation you sense coming toward you is a dream you will wake from. But the primitive memory that surfaces in that paralysis, The earliest moment your body learned this sensation of being held down by forces beyond your control is not just evidence of what was done to you. It is the origin story of the warrior God is finishing. Every overcomer was first overcome. Every deliverer was first delivered. The chains you felt at 3 in the morning are the precise chains God trained your hands to break. First in yourself, then in everyone you were sent to reach. The light bulb blew out again, and you stood in the sudden dark and felt something that was not quite surprise, because you have been here before. In this specific confluence of high-tension spiritual season and inexplicable material malfunction, where the technology stutters and the electronics behave as though the environment itself is under a kind of pressure that the physical world is struggling to contain. The car that would not start on the morning of your most important meeting. The phone that went dark in the middle of the conversation that was shifting something significant. The appliances that chose the week of your highest spiritual activation to begin their coordinated resignation from functionality. None of this is superstition. None of this is the primitive thinking of a mind that cannot accept mechanical coincidence. This is the documented experience of every person walking in an anointing that is actively opposed. The electromagnetic interference that accompanies intense spiritual warfare. The material world registering the frequency war being conducted in the invisible dimension and expressing that registration through the failure of systems that depend on stable, energetic environments to operate. The narcissist in your life contributes to this phenomenon in ways that are measurable by their effects, even when the mechanism resists conventional explanation. Because chronic, sustained psychological abuse generates a stress load in the body and in the immediate environment of the targeted person that is not merely emotional but physiological, and some would argue electromagnetic. The cortisol, the hypervigilance, the sustained activation of the threat response system, these are not merely feelings. They are biological events with measurable physical signatures, and the sustained presence of an energy vampire draining your reserves creates an instability in your immediate environment that expresses itself through the burned-out bulb, the failed battery, the device that cannot hold its charge, because neither can you, because you have been pouring current into a relationship or a dynamic or a family system that is drawing more than the circuit was designed to carry. The spiritual action God is taking in this scene is the deliberate interruption of the systems that have been feeding your distraction, that have been providing just enough functional normalcy to keep you from recognizing how untenable your current energetic output has become. He blows the bulbs, so you will sit in the dark long enough to hear him. The darkness is not a curse, it is an appointment. As I teach heavily and deeply to those who arrive at the 3 keys to a prosperous life trilogy, I've already left the link for you in the pinned comment. This weight on your chest is just a symptom, a surface expression of a much deeper spiritual diagnosis, which is that you have been living in an environment contaminated by the specific and suffocating energy of chronic, covert, unacknowledged envy. And envy does not just corrupt the person who carries it, it corrupts the atmosphere they inhabit. And you have been breathing that atmosphere so long, you stopped noticing the quality of the air had changed. The heaviness settled into the room before anyone spoke. You noticed it the way you notice a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. Something changed in the molecules. Something withdrew. Something that had been moving freely suddenly went very still, with a stillness that was not peace, but its photographic negative. Envy is one of the oldest spiritual toxins on record, catalogued across every wisdom tradition that has ever tried to name the invisible forces that corrode human community. And its atmospheric effect is not metaphorical. It is real, it is measurable in the physiological responses of the people who enter spaces saturated with it. It is registered in the body as an instinctive protective contraction, a drawing inward, a dimming of the personal energy field in the unconscious attempt to reduce the target signature that the envy is locked onto. When the person who cannot celebrate your light walks into the room, every soul present feels the temperature drop, even if no conscious mind can articulate why the energy shifted. Animals are better at this than humans. Your dog that stiffened, your cat that retreated, the creature in your home that registered the arrival of the contaminated frequency before your socialized human mind could override your perception with politeness and good manners and the performance of normalcy. The spiritual tribunal has a name for what happens in those rooms. It is called the silent tribunal, the moment when the spiritual realm weighs the intentions of everyone present and the weight of hidden malice bends the atmosphere toward a specific, uncomfortable gravity. Your discomfort in that room was not social anxiety, it was accurate spiritual assessment. And the divine promotion encoded in that scene is this: the person whose envy fills the room with that specific heaviness has just confirmed in the spiritual court that you carry something worth coveting. You cannot be envied for something you do not genuinely possess. The weight in the room is your enemy's involuntary testimony to your anointing. You never saw it coming from that direction. That is the design of a Judas operation. It does not come with a warning. It does not announce itself through the channels you have been monitoring. It does not arrive wearing the face of an enemy because you have defenses against enemies. It arrives wearing the face of intimacy, familiarity, shared history, the particular softness of a relationship that has been close enough and long enough to teach you its rhythms, close enough that the betrayal, when it came, did not just break something external, but reached all the way into the architecture of your self-concept and fractured something foundational, something you did not know was load-bearing until the weight it was carrying came crashing through the floor. The Judas sleeping in the same tent is the enemy's most efficient deployment because it requires no external asset. It simply identifies the person who is already inside your perimeter, already in possession of your vulnerabilities, your private confessions, your unguarded moments, your half-formed dreams that you shared before they were strong enough to survive exposure, and it offers that person something: validation, proximity to another power source, the intoxicating satisfaction of the narcissistic injury finally being avenged, in exchange for the strategic use of everything they know about you. The psychological devastation of this kind of betrayal is categorically different from the wound delivered by an acknowledged enemy, because the enemy's wound confirms the relational map you were already operating from, while the Judas wound rewrites the entire map retroactively and leaves you unable to trust the accuracy of your own perception of relationship, your own read of loyalty, your own sense of who is safe. That is precisely the intended outcome. A person who cannot trust their own discernment is a person who will not step into their assignment, because every divine assignment requires the confidence to move on internal revelation that other people cannot yet verify. The enemy uses the Judas betrayal to install a perceptual virus that makes you doubt the very spiritual faculty you need most in the season ahead. But the spiritual tribunal sees the Judas, and heaven's record of that betrayal is already being converted into the testimony that will set free everyone who sat in that same devastation and believed the map of themselves that the betrayal tried to draw. The dog started barking before the knock came, before the car turned into the driveway, before any perceivable signal announced the arrival of the person who calls themselves your friend, who speaks the language of friendship so convincingly that your conscious mind still reaches for the benefit of the doubt, even as your nervous system fires every alarm it has available. Animals do not rationalize. They do not override the signal with the social pressure to be gracious, to give the benefit of the doubt, to extend charity. To not be the kind of person who turns someone away based on a vague feeling that something is off about them. The animal in your home, the dog that bristles, the creature that retreats without explanation, is operating from an unfiltered perception of frequency that your socialized human mind has been trained to dismiss as irrational. You were told, early and repeatedly, that feelings without logical justification are not evidence, that you cannot refuse a relationship, cannot set a boundary, cannot trust a warning that you cannot document and present in the court of reasonable social expectation. And so you overrode the animal in yourself, the part that would have simply walked away from the frequency that felt wrong, and you substituted politeness for protection and called it spiritual maturity when in reality it was spiritual vulnerability dressed in the costume of grace. The narcissist who performs friendship has studied the behavioral requirements of genuine connection with the precision of someone who has never felt it naturally, and therefore had to reverse engineer it from the outside in. And they are often extraordinarily convincing to the conscious mind, while being immediately transparent to any creature that reads energy instead of behavior. The intrusive thought that follows the interaction with this kind of presence is not projection. It is the mind finally catching up to what the body registered the moment they walked through the door. Your primitive memory surfaces the first time you felt this specific dissonance, this gap between what was being said and what was being meant, and reminds you that you have been here before, in a different body, but the same dynamic, and survived. God is done asking you to silence the animal. The reacting dog is not embarrassing your discernment, it is confirming it. You looked at the clock and it said 11:11, and something in you paused. Not because you have decided to be superstitious, but because this is the third time this week that specific sequence has appeared at the exact moment your mind was processing something significant about your future, about your assignment, about the transition you have been feeling move through your life like a seismic event that hasn't fully surfaced yet. The numerical coincidence is the universe's most accessible language for the human who has been conditioned to trust evidence they can see and verify. Numbers are concrete, numbers are unambiguous, numbers bypass the enemy's usual strategy of making spiritual communication feel subjective and therefore deniable. When you keep seeing 11:11 or 3:33 or any sequence that arrives with a consistency too precise to dismiss, what you are witnessing is the convergence of divine timing markers, confirmation signals embedded in the fabric of created reality by a God who knows that your rational mind needs something it can document. Something it can return to in the 3 a.m. hour when the enemy is running his most sophisticated doubt campaign and telling you that everything you have sensed about your promotion is the elaborate self-delusion of a person too desperate for meaning to accept randomness. The psychological warfare operation around numerical confirmation is the enemy's attempt to make you intellectually embarrassed by your own perception of divine communication, to make the experience of receiving these signals feel naive, unsophisticated, the province of people who have not done the serious intellectual and spiritual work that you have clearly done. But the intellectual embarrassment is the trap, not the perception. God has always used the ordinary materials of the created world to communicate with the people he is moving. Burning bushes, still small voices, dreams, signs. And the person sophisticated enough to dismiss all of those as superstition is the person sophisticated enough to miss every word God is saying. The spiritual tribunal records every moment of divine communication that was received and every moment that was dismissed in the name of intellectual respectability. The 11:11 is the compass waking you up. The question is whether you are awake enough to follow the direction it is pointing. You crossed the barrier. You cleared the threshold that the enemy spent the last season throwing every available resource at keeping you on the wrong side of. The assignment launched. The thing that was promised broke through into manifestation, into visibility, into the specific material reality that makes it undeniable, that transforms it from a private spiritual conviction into a documented external fact. And you stood in that moment and felt something that was not, as you had imagined it would be. The triumphant public exhilaration of a victory finally arrived. You felt the quiet, complex, slightly disorienting fullness of a person who has been running toward a horizon for so long that arriving at it produces not the expected explosion of joy, but something more layered and more private. Something that moved through you silently and brought tears that you cried completely alone, because there was no one in the room who had been in the wilderness with you, no one who knew the specific quality of the desert you crossed to get here. No one who could receive the full weight of what this moment meant without needing you to translate and justify and explain and perform the emotion in a way that was legible to people who took a different road. The solitary victory is the loneliest moment in a chosen one's journey, lonelier sometimes than the loneliest night of the isolation that preceded it, because it exposes with perfect clarity how singular your path has been, how completely God escorted you through a preparation process that did not come with companions, how thoroughly the friends you started with fell away or were removed or simply could not keep pace with the altitude your assignment required, and how the milestone you just reached is yours, in a way that cannot be fully shared with anyone who was not inside the specific, unrepeatable, soul-level experience of the becoming. This is not tragedy dressed as triumph. This is the precise texture of the kind of victory that God authors for people whose assignment is to go first, to open the road, to demonstrate the possible for everyone who is still in the wilderness, watching your progress and deciding whether to believe that their own breakthrough is real. You cry alone because the victory was forged alone, and the tears are the release valve on a pressure that built in solitude. But hear this: the God who watched every moment of that solitary making has never once looked away. The chain broke at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday that felt indistinguishable from every other morning of the winter. You spent believing nothing would ever change, that the pattern was permanent, that the oppressive weight pressing down on your life was simply the atmosphere you were born into and would die inside of, that the dreams of a different future were the mercy delusions of a mind trying to survive an inescapable present. The first sign was not dramatic. It was a stillness, an absence of the low-grade anxiety that had been your constant companion for so long you had stopped registering it as distinct from your own nervous system, as though the oppression had colonized your baseline so completely that peace felt like a symptom worth investigating rather than a state worth receiving. Your body registered it before your mind did. The muscles in your shoulders unlocked, the held breath you had been carrying for months released in a long, involuntary exhale that carried in it something you could not fully name, but that tasted in the back of your throat like the first clean air after a long time.